Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then subscribe now because this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University. Today, I'm joined by Professor Lettie Bishop and Senior Lecturer Dr. Martin Lindley. Dr. Martin Lindley is a Senior Lecturer and Director of Biosciences within the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. He is a Chartered Biologist and leads his own research group, Translational Chemical Biology. His main area of research revolves around omega-3 fatty acids in the diet and their impact upon health and performance. But he's also working on analytical chemistry of exhaled breath and volatile organic compounds specifically related to disease states and elite athlete performance. Martin works closely with the Biochemical Society and is Vice Chair of the Clinical and Translational Research team. Lettie Bishop is Professor of Exercise Immunology in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. She is the current Chair of the UK Society for Exercise Immunology. Lettie's research interests lie in the impacts of exercise on immunity, inflammation and infection in athletes, the general population and those with long-term conditions. Lettie works closely with clinical colleagues and physiologists from the English Institute of Sport, and current projects include investigating the role of iron regulation on female athletes' health. Lettie has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, editorials, book chapters and review articles in areas of exercise immunology, including as co-author on the International Society of Exercise and Immunology consensus statements on exercise and immune function and on immunonutrition and exercise. Today, we're going to discuss exercise, immune defence and illness in elite athletes. You'll hear Lettie and Martin discuss elite athletes and their susceptibility to illness. We'll discuss training volume and intensity and its potential impact upon immune function, before finally providing some advice to elite athletes regarding the current COVID-19 pandemic. Hi Lettie, hi Martin. Thanks for being on the Experts in Sport podcast.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having us.
Anytime. First, I just want to start with a question. So we're going to be looking at exercise, immune defence and illness for elite athletes. So my question really is, are elite athletes more susceptible to illness?
There is a lot of evidence these days to suggest that yes, they are. It's not the majority, but it's a significant group. And the key point here is that a lot of the studies that have been done probably prior to the last 5 or 10 years weren't done in elite athletes, but there's more and more evidence now that's being collected at major championships. And so there is definitely this group, and it does seem to be particularly respiratory infections and gastro infections that seem to be some of the biggest problems. And I think the big point about all of this is that there's work out there now which suggests that if you can't train to your optimum, then obviously if you're not able to train, if you're always sick, you're not likely to reach your performance goals. And so although it's not the majority of athletes, for these athletes that it does affect, they may not actually ever be able to reach their optimum. And so it's become more and more of an issue, and something that's concerning people in the governing bodies to make sure that all these talented people really can meet their optimum performance goals.
When you mention group of athletes, what do you mean by group of athletes?
So, to be honest, it seems to be mainly endurance events, but also team sports as well seem to be affected more than the sprint power type events and resistance events. So, but actually the data that comes from, the Olympic Games, it's across all sports. There's no necessary pattern. Early studies, it was always ultramarathons and swimming and things like that. But that was probably because that was an accessible group for those researchers to get to. But now we're actually collecting this data from things like the Olympics. It doesn't seem to be a pattern. So 2012 Olympics, for example, respiratory infections were high in beach volleyball, as well as some of the other sports, that swimming and some of the longer distance athletics that you'd expect. But it doesn't seem to be specific sports as such. I think the key point is that it's more endurance, it's a longer distance, longer events, and it seems to be also related to just the general athlete lifestyle. So it's not just about things like immune function, it's also the general behaviours as well that come with being an elite athlete.
So there's a sort of a big emphasis on the exercise load and the exercise intensity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the big problems is that it's that the effect of exercise on immune function, for example, is certainly dependent on exercise intensity and exercise duration. The longer you exercise, the harder you exercise, the greater the effects. So what would be a recommendation is to include more of the spike sessions, avoid too many of the long sessions, and especially at the moment, I mean, it's one of those things that, people can't do the longer sessions. So I think spike sessions are something that perhaps a little bit more doable, but definitely high intensity, but lower the volume that you're doing and allow recovery, because it seems to be recovery that's that key issue.
I know this is one of those questions that everybody hates because there is no right and wrong answer. But in terms of when we're talking high intensity and we're talking duration, what are we talking about? I know it's different for different athletes, but a general perception or an example, because I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between what a footballer might do, what a marathon runner might do. So can you give us any kind of scope on that?
As a general rule, we always say try and keep sessions to below an hour. If you're going to be doing high intensity, try and keep them to below an hour. It's very different as you say, for different sports and what your normal training is. But certainly, the more intense it is, and the more tired you feel at the end, you've got to allow yourself recovery. And using the hour-like benchmark is not a bad way of going.
You agree with that, Martin? Is that similar?
Yeah, there's the hour benchmark is quite a good little indicator because you have such a range of different types of training. The games-based players, they tend to be able to do high-intensity shuttle work, and they tend to extend it over much lengthier periods, and that the volume creeps up and up and up. So if you can put a time limit on it, then you are restricting really the stress on the body. So yeah, it's difficult because so many sports have so many different training regimes, but a 60-minute window is probably a good indicator.
And what are we talking intensity within that window? Are we talking high intensity being above 85% and bouts of how long? Are we talking 90%? Where are we in those realms?
That's a tough one to answer. Generally speaking, I would say anything above 75, 80, because would be at high intensity, but keeping that up, for elite athletes over an hour is probably something they would be able to do anyway. But yeah, I mean, for interval training, it would probably be spikes of, much higher, and then with moderate in between. Martin, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that. That's a tough one to answer.
Yeah, it becomes so individual on that intensity side of things. Every athlete will have their own markers with their heart rate and their intensity and timings, etc. And I say elite endurance athletes are going out hammering away at 80, 85, 90%, wouldn't consider that high intensity, whereas other players, that will put them on their knees quite quickly.
Yeah, so it's very individualised to the sport, and obviously S&C coaches out there will be able to prescribe that to these elite athletes who already...
Yeah, I mean, and certainly from a general rule in terms of the consensus statement that the International Society of Exercise Immunology wrote a few years ago on keeping athletes healthy, there's a kind of thing that, if you're doing progression of training, don't increase load by more than 5 or 10% each time you increase the progression. So it's very individualised. It's not like a set absolute amount we can say, but for an individual, don't ramp up their training more than 5%, 10% each time you're increasing the progression.
And then final additional question on that then. So you spoke about recovery as well. How many sessions a week are we talking for these kind of, elite athletes? And again, I know it's going to be a difficult question.
One of the hardest things is to tell an elite athlete to recover and take a break, because the training is the performance, is the making the goals. So it's really, really tricky. What we can do is recommend, and then what they do is something that they'll take with their own individual context. What we would say is try and do repeated sessions in a day rather than one single very long session. some of the studies in terms of immune function suggest that, giving at least 5-6 hours in between a session will allow things to return to baseline. But that's obviously on an acute basis. If you're doing that every single day, eventually you're going to exhaust yourself. So it's probably just listen to your body. As a recommendation, as I say, try and avoid longer sessions and have more individual sessions during the day, repeated sessions during a day. As for recovery days, well, we always recommend them, but whether or not they're done is probably a different thing and depends on the athlete.
I think you're spot on. I think some of the African training centres they've got for the elite endurance runners now seem to have some very good models in that they do 2 sessions a day, but one is very early and one is much later on. So they give themselves a long period in between. They are high intensity when they do it, but they do also enforce rest days. So, but when they're not actually doing the training session, they are completely relaxing. Now, what it means is that they've actually separated themselves away from their daily routine, and they end up in a monastic situation of, if you're not running, you're lying down, which is a fairly severe way of doing it. But it does reflect the recommendations that you do need to be resting. And I think it probably is pertinent to the situation we have right now, in that we're at home, we're isolated, but we tend to be keeping busy, doing things. And I think the elite athletes have got to really look at themselves and say they do need to be resting. If they are still training, they are still doing the high intensity work, then they need to be recovering and they need to be resting. They can't be busy through the rest of the time because the body just won't recover.
And that's an absolutely excellent point as well, Martin, because one of the things that, we talk about this illness in athletes, and it is absolutely multifactorial. There's the immune stuff, but there's also a massive behavioural component. And at the moment, people are out of their routine, keeping busy. It's a lot of people, it's stressful, it's anxiety. And, keep having those recovery days where you're not doing anything, you're actually giving yourself a break, your mind a break. I think it's absolutely important because all of those things contribute to your risk for illness as well.
Perfect. Well, so we've set the context a little bit now in terms of what athletes may or may not be doing exercise-wise. Do you want to touch on in a little bit more depth the actual immune system and what's going on with these athletes during high intensity bouts, the recovery? Why are they more susceptible from an immune function perspective?
Yeah, so the immune system is affected by physiological stress. Equally, it's affected by environmental stress. So if you're, out of this current situation, if you're also training at altitude or in the heat, or those will also add additional stresses onto the immune system. Psychological stress is a huge problem, lack of sleep. All of those things will all influence the immune system. There's all these things that will influence how well your immune system is able to respond to a challenge. The way in which the immune system works, you've got some innate or mechanisms that you're born with, and they kick in pretty quickly, and they'll just respond to anything they recognise that shouldn't be there, and tries to get rid of it. And then you've got a longer term, more adaptive, bit more subtle response, or more specific response, which will try and give a very coordinated way of getting rid of a particular germ or pathogen, or something that's simply there. And that's particularly these T cells. So these antiviral T cells. Now, one of the problems with athletes is when you're exercising, or any problems with physiological stress, is that it will have a negative effect on your immune system depending on your exercise intensity and duration. Shouldn't probably say negative, probably say it has a bigger effect on your immune system. If the harder you exercise, the bigger the effect on the immune system, the more it makes it either overstimulated or actually after exercise, you can actually see a decrease in the number of immune cells in your circulation. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem because it just means that they've probably left the circulation and gone into the tissues, but it does probably mean that they're not necessarily going to be able to get to where they're needed and able to fight off infections. So we certainly think that one of the reasons why athletes might be more susceptible to infections is because the strenuous exercise causes these dysfunction of the immune system. So it's not able to mount such a coordinated response to an infectious challenge.
Generally, how can athletes monitor that? And how would they be monitoring that in this current situation?
So in terms of monitoring it, one of the best ways of actually monitoring how your immune system might be faring is to see how tired you are. Fatigue is an absolutely brilliant surrogate marker for stress on your immune system. And there's some quite nice studies done with American America's Cup yachtsmen a few years ago, and they just asked a very simple question every single day to their yachtsmen: your fatigue levels, are they worse than normal or better than normal? And they found that it was rated quite well to how their immune system was responding. And it's something certainly that, you know, we often say to coaches that measuring immune function actually is quite expensive. There's not that many reliable point of care measurements. It's such a multifaceted thing that measuring one thing on its own isn't necessarily going to give you an overall indication. So fatigue, if you're feeling tired, is probably a good indication that your immune system is under threat and probably need to have some recovery.
And I think because we're talking about elite athletes, I think this is quite a simple thing for them to do, because they already have a long-term training plan. They already have a day-to-day training diary, adding in a column where they're just giving a reflective feeling on their fatigue, and then reflecting on that every week to see if we have a slow progression. So
yeah,
I think
great idea, yeah.
Yeah, when you have that, I feel okay compared to yesterday, a little bit worse, and then you reflect on it over a weekly basis, you find out you're on that slow progression of gradually drifting. So because elite athletes have these diaries and they are recording their training sessions on a regular basis, just adding that fatigue score in. And say, as Lettie says, it can be a very simple question. It just needs to be consistent, and you ask the same one every day and then reflect on it on a weekly basis, and you'll see if you're drifting.
And how would this affect performance, this COVID-19 at the moment? So we looked briefly there at the immune system and illness. How would we say this will affect performance? I know in some of the slides you sent over, Lettie, you talked about the immune system, but then also performance. So we talked about people getting ill and obviously missing training sessions. Mm-hmm. So what do you think the current situation will do in regards to that?
I think the main issue at the moment is that people simply aren't able to do what they usually do. And because this is quite strong evidence, it's actually a paper by Ray Smith and Drew from a couple of years ago. And it said, those that completed more than 80% of their planned training weeks were 7 times more likely to reach their performance goals. So at the moment, I suspect that a big issue and a big concern is the fact that you're not able to train as you would do normally. You're restricted in what you're able to do. You might be restricted in what you have at home. And there's probably a vast variation in what people are able to do at home, depending on what sorts of sports they do. I mean, swimmers, for example, really will be struggling in what they can do, I would have thought. So I think the biggest impact at the moment is the fact that there's going to be this lack of training. And when the lack of training, normally when we talk about that, is one of the causes of lack of training would be getting an illness. And at the moment, I think it's actually an external factor that's causing the lack of training, the fact they simply aren't able to go out and do it. So, so I think that perhaps if people are staying inside, they are removing their exposure to pathogens, which is actually one of the major recommendations that we give to athletes to try and stay healthy anyway. So that's actually been incorporated in what we're all having to do at the moment. And the biggest issue is the fact they're not able to train properly, which will be causing, I suspect, anxiety as to what their ability to reach their performance goals and their aims.
I think that the study that you're talking about that you sent through to me was for every week of incomplete training, the chance of success was reduced by 26%.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
But I know that me and Martin and I discussed some of this prior to the podcast around kind of what should elite athletes be thinking about now during lockdown? And there's this balance between health and performance. And I think, Martin, you've got an opinion on what they should be looking at, I think.
Yeah, I'd actually put a really positive spin on the elite athlete group being isolated at the moment, because we're in a situation of pandemic and we're all trying to avoid contact and a viral infection. Elite athletes, as we've discussed, if they're working at that real high level, are going to be more susceptible. Their immune system isn't working optimally. They're more likely to catch an infection. Well, they're not allowed to train. Therefore, they're not training optimally. Therefore, their immune system hopefully is recovering slightly. They're isolated, which means they're less likely to be in a source of antigen. Therefore, pathogens aren't there. We're going to be less likely to become ill. So from that perspective, the isolation and the lack of training, I think, is a very positive thing. The problem is the anxiety and stress
Absolutely.
that athletes will feel worrying about competition. Now, luckily, they've postponed the Olympics by 12 months. They've postponed the football. They've postponed all the major events have actually gone off the calendar. So my recommendation would be to not worry about the performance because the competitions have been postponed, but to be happy that we're isolated and reducing our training volume because it may allow the immune system to stay healthier in this situation of viral infection.
Absolutely, I fully agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. And it does mean then that when things do return to normal, you might actually be in a better place than you were when this all started.
Exactly.
I think that's a key message that Martin and I, when we spoke about this previously, I think that might be a key message that I don't know whether that message is out there to elite athletes. What's your feeling on that?
The things that I've seen and the things that I've been asked about have all been about athletes and being ill, and seem to overlook the fact that as long as people are isolating, they're not going to be exposed. So, and like Martin says, well, you know, if you think about the things that the reason why people get ill is because either they're exposed to something or because their immune system's not working properly. They're the main things, essentially. You either got an increased exposure to things that cause you to get ill, or the thing that stops you getting ill isn't working properly. If you're in this situation where you're stopping yourself being exposed to things that get you ill, and you're resting more and you're under less stress, so your immune system's working properly, then actually you're in a pretty good place. And all the things that I've read have all been about should athletes beast themselves basically while they're at home. But why would you do that? Why it doesn't fit into any training program? Why would you necessarily need to do that? And then all the other things being about keeping moderately active, which is a whole new conversation for another day. And because keeping moderately active does actually have benefits in terms of potentially increasing your tolerance to infection and prevention. But that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, all the things I've seen have either been like, you know, horror stories about infections and athletes, or keeping generally healthy.
Yeah, the messages we've seen have been about athletes who are upset about their competition schedule changing, athletes who are upset about their inability to train at high levels. You can't change the competition schedule, and inability to train is the restriction. I think that the message that needs to be out there is to be a positive one of we can do something which is beneficial to us as elite athletes in this time. And stressing is going to be one of the worst things. Yeah. But we already have the isolation and we already have the reduced volume. So we're 2 ticks in the box already, as it were.
Take advantage of it. Turn it to your advantage, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I suppose the take-home message for elite athletes or elite coaches out there is almost don't worry too much about the training. Take this as a time to kind of improve your health and be ready to train when you get out of this. Because competition has been removed. You're going to have time. Even the footballers are going to have 4 to 6 weeks to train and be ready for competition.
Yeah, but I think the key point then is that when we do get back to it, don't suddenly increase progression. We talked about that massive increase in progression. Sorry, keep that. Don't suddenly have a massive increment in training load. Again, you still got to hold back a bit and do this incremental increase, because that will then make sure you can maintain those benefits that you've already had on your immune system.
I fear for that random one. I fear for that a little bit elite athletes. You may be able to try and restrict, but we all know they want to work as hard as possible.
Absolutely.
And I think that's going to be a problem. I think it's going to be a problem for the general population as well. That those people who love training in a gym and they want to go back and just go mental. Yeah. I think that is going to be a problem all across the board, that people will hit things too hard. Yeah. So again, from an immune function perspective, and if we talk about this second spike with COVID, I suppose that's a huge thing to go, hold on, we need to hold back on that.
Yeah, I guess absolutely. Yeah, suddenly you start, relaxing some of these restrictions and people are out and about and they're going to the gym and they're, suddenly let out and really, really pushing themselves. And then we get the second spike. That could easily happen. That could be a real problem. So I guess it's another thing about, making sure these restrictions aren't lifted too early. You're never going to stop people when they've been kept inside for the best part of 2 or 3 months from, we can give advice, but people are people, and if they just feel like they've been released, they're going to just go and do it, aren't they? But we can only tell them this could happen.
Yeah, I think the return to training, as it were, or the return to normal training status, I mean, we've talked, Martin, about the need for a podcast to talk about that return to training for the injury status and the fact that everybody's going to be pulling hamstrings. But I think there is for the elite athletes specifically this immune function and the increase in training load that is really important. Yeah. So they will be coming back into training from a reduced load, and they really do have to graduate it when they come back, for not just for the injuries and not just for the overload progression, as it were, but for the immune system response as well.
Absolutely. And that's probably the biggest risk for them at the moment, is actually what happens at the end of all of this.
So, I mean, we've only got a couple of minutes left, really. So, Lettie, do you just want to just briefly conclude in terms of the immune function and the current situation, and then your advice regarding going back to training?
So I say that at the moment, in the current situation, as we've said already, the main things why anyone gets ill is because you're either being exposed, you've got an increased exposure to the things that make you ill, or the thing that protects you, your immune system, isn't working properly. At the moment, with the restrictions on us, the fact is you're not going to be exposed so much as long as you're following the restrictions properly. And the reduced training load that you're probably experiencing because of the restrictions placed on us actually is a benefit to your immune system, because it's giving it time to recover and you're not under such levels of physiological stress. The main thing to concern at the moment probably psychological stress, and that equally has a very strong influence on immune function. So for me, that might be the biggest concern at the moment. Looking further forward, when the restrictions get lifted, then the biggest concern will be doing too much too soon. And one of the things that we've always suggested for athletes is that the rate of progression of training is always controlled, no more than 5 to 10% increases each time that you increase your training loads. That's something that's going to become really, really key when this all becomes lifted, and that's something that you need to be able to do to protect your immune system. Otherwise, you're going to get ill, and then you're going to have all of those problems, and the past 2 to 3 months becomes wasted.
Perfect, thank you, Martha. You got anything to add around recommendations for the future?
So recommendation-wise, I think Lettie's hit the nail on the head perfectly there. I would just summarize it as don't worry, be happy. And when we come out of this, train smarter, not harder.
Love it. Perfect. I love a simple finish. So guys, I really appreciate you guys. So am I. I always appreciate you guys coming on. So thank you very much for this chat. Martin, I'm sure we're going to do many more to give different perspectives. I think we're going to touch on psychology and some other ones, nutrition. I think we're going to look at physiology. So we'll get a lot of different angles around what's going on at the moment, but they'll be coming soon. So thanks guys very much. I will
no problem.
Look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you'd like to get in contact with Professor Lettie Bishop, she is available on n.c.bishop@loughborough.ac.uk. Or if you'd like to get in contact with Dr. Martin Lindley, he is available on m.r.lindley@loughborough.ac.uk. Or you can find their contact details and those of other academics at Loughborough by visiting our website. Bye for now. See you next time.